because those AI algorithms have shown to be biased or not worked well, they've caused harm in certain populations, right? And so when they cause harm, people don't trust them anymore. People don't want to use them. But more importantly, people don't want to contribute to them. They don't want to share their data, share their experience, share their insights. And so by having those algorithms not working and causing harm, we have this lack of sharing of data, sharing of engagement. And because we lack this data sharing and engagement, well, obviously the algorithms don't work for that population. So it's like a catch 22 where we've got to do a better job in building trust between patients and healthcare providers so that we can demonstrate that, you know what, AI can benefit everyone if we have the trust and the data and the knowledge.
Hi, I'm Lester, and welcome to another episode of What's with RWE. And we have an amazing guest with us today. It is something that I've been nerding out for a while now. I read the recent Evo 2 paper, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail. But we have one of the authors and one of the researchers that was part of this team. So Dr. Tina Hernandez-Boussard is on the podcast with us today. How's it going, Tina?
Going really well, thank you.
I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction and then we'll kind of just jump right in because Tina has a very, very accomplished, incredibly long title, actually. Your colleague Lino, when he sent this over to me. So I'll make sure to write it down so I have it on hand. So, Tina is the Associate Dean of Research and Professor of Medicine, Biomedical Data Sciences, Surgery, and Epidemiology and Population Health at Stanford University. She focuses on mitigating bias. Actually, she does a lot of research, but one of her core research kind of themes is mitigating bias and enhancing equity within artificial intelligence applications in healthcare settings. So hopefully that's just a very very brief overview. We'll dive into it deeper, but maybe we can start off, Tina, with what does it mean to mitigate bias and enhance equity in healthcare AI applications? Why is it important?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's really been an emerging topic in the literature recently. Everybody is concerned about the more and more that AI is being used in healthcare and in data science. How do we think about how it's fair and equitable? So what does that mean? Well, that means that when we're developing our AI models, we need to think about the data that we use to train the models. And the more diverse the data is, the better these models can deal with real world scenarios. So, what does that mean? Diversity means not just like race and ethnicity, diversity means it needs to be comprehensive across race, ethnicity, gender, ages, social economic status, geographic locations, and healthcare conditions, right? And so when we're training these models, we want to really be sure that we avoid like overrepresentation or underrepresentation of specific groups, because that's where the model can start leaning towards biases and outcomes. So it's about the data we train. And then once we have that right data set, it's about thinking about the models we develop and the questions we're asking. So we need to be sure that these models really consider the unique needs and behaviors and particular challenges of different populations to ensure we capture that when we're making predictions.
Fantastic. And maybe if you could maybe give an example of a bias like that you could foresee, not to say that this bias actually necessarily exists, but if you had to, provide an example of what that bias could look like in the artificial intelligence space, what just for the audience that isn't really familiar with this, what does that actually mean in terms of an equitable
Right.
outcome?
So sure. So let me give you an example, and this is an example that's been studied a lot in the literature. And that example is that certain populations with lower social economic status have less access to healthcare. We know that, right? In the U.S., this is a big problem. So if we develop a model that only includes patients, for example, with private healthcare insurance. When somebody comes in with a public health insurance or with less access to health insurance, the model is not going to know how to accurately predict their healthcare need and their healthcare utilization, because it's going to just assume they have the same access and same utilization patterns as that dominant population. So that's where we might have biases in that it will make bad predictions or inaccurate predictions for that population.
Got it. No, thanks a lot for giving that example because I think sometimes when people think about it, think people think about it in a it's too abstract. So I think that's a great example to kind of lean on. Now, not to pivot super hard, but I mean, I have to talk about Evo 2 with you just a bit, right? And then of course we'll go
Of
back to some of
course.
the other research that you're undertaking. But the evil, maybe you can explain to the audience, and our audience tends does it's everyone. It's assumed there's billions of people watching, hopefully. And what did Evo 2 do that was so, let's say, groundbreaking, and what is Evo 2?
Right. So it's a fascinating project, and I feel like I was so lucky to be involved in this project. So Evo 2 is really a groundbreaking AI model designed to understand and generate DNA sequences from all forms of life, right? From bacteria to humans. So think of it as a language model. We all are kind of becoming familiar with ChatGTP and how it can produce, respond to sentences, etc. So think about Evo 2 as a language model for biology. So instead of predicting the next word in a sentence, it predicts the next DNA base pair in a genome, right? So this allows Evo 2 to really analyze and design biological systems at a molecular level. And so it can help researchers predict, for example, how genetic changes or gene modifications might affect organisms, or it can even think about how we might generate new DNA sequences that could be used in synthetic biology or for drug treatments or for medications, etc. So really important in that sense, in that it's the first, DNA large language model at this scale.
Yes, and the thing that fascinated me quite a bit with this model, in some ways, it is like the LLMs that everyone's familiar with, especially ChatGPT, in that somehow the individual bases that make up DNA, the A, T, C, G, is common amongst like all species, all living life. But what was surprising to me was by training this model on such a diverse set of species. It wasn't just human genomes, but it was genomes from across
Yep.
the animal kingdom that it was able to understand like how a genome is put together. That there's almost like a semantic layer that's above the basis that it was able
Right.
to understand that's common amongst the kind of all the everything that's like I guess a lot of life within on Earth. Am I understanding that
That,
correctly, or am I
that's
just making that up?
That's exactly what it is. And when we think about in the past how we've studied biology, we've studied these different levels of life forms. So C. elegans, yeast, to understand the basic fundamentals of life, cell cycle, things, DNA synthesis. And so that is kind of the concept behind Evo 2 is we really wanted to understand the evolutionary pieces of these basic fundamental forms of life, to understand how they fit together in this complex DNA sort of a dictionary of sequences. So and just to say a little bit more about that, because there were so many different forms of life included. Evo 2 was trained on 9.3 trillion DNA base pairs, right? Covering just a wide range of organisms from bacteria to plants to animals. And so that's really where it had the power to learn these really important fundamental pieces of or aspects of functions of life. So that was kind of what was unique about it.
Yeah, I guess what surprised me a lot, and I actually had some other comments from others on LinkedIn about this, was it wasn't trained on a huge amount of human genomes, which is a lot of people assume that in order to understand what makes humans humans is you got to have a ton of genomes. So there's like the 100,000 genomes project in the UK. I think there's a million genomes project in either China, and I think the US has all of us as well. So there's a large amount of genomes being produced from that effort, and it's to understand sort of what makes us in biology and disease and so forth. But this was not done that way. This was done on so many species, so that it surprised me. It's almost like we have a this common layer. Did that surprise your team, or no? You kind
Well,
of
that was
expected that to.
that was look, that was very intentional. And here's something that so my team was really focused on how do we think about the safety and the ethical aspects of this, right? And one of our big concerns was bias in the human reference genome. Right. So there's been a lot of research coming out showing the human reference genome is actually lacks diversity, right? It lacks a lot of um, um, sequences or genome aspects from Africa, from other areas of the world. It's very European Anglo-centric. And so we were very concerned that if we were, training Evo using this human reference genome, that we might learn these biases. We might learn very specific traits to this particular population. And so that was what was, I think, was really amazing about Evo 2 is we were able to learn these functions, these gene functions, protein functions from these different species and actually see how we could pull this together to understand some aspects of the human genome. And in the Evo 2 paper, we gave they provided, an example using a breast cancer oncogene. And how we could predict how modifications in that oncogene were really important or change gene function. So that is a perfect example of how we could learn these functions from plants, from bacteria, et cetera, to make insights into the human genome.
That's absolutely amazing. Just so I'm clear, and hopefully the audience is clear about this. The this system had never seen specifically this type of this mutation in the BRCA gene, right? Which is the famous
Correct.
gene that promotes potential cancer, someone to develop cancer, and it never seen this mutation yet. It was able to identify it. Is am I understanding that
Yes,
correctly?
that is correct.
So I okay, I'm gonna ask this question, Tina. I just have to. It's a super pothead question. I apologize in advance for this. When your team and the rest of the team learned about what was this male models capable of, did it make you think of like when I after reading the paper, I almost felt spiritual in an odd way that we're all somehow oddly connected in this way that's so it's not just
Fundamental, right?
yes, it's so fundamental, which I found incredibly odd that we could be connected this way, and I don't fully understand how that comes to be and
Yeah.
why that is the case. And I hope someone actually explores that direction. Like, why did we? How come we're so such a commonality amongst all species on how the
Yeah.
genome is actually created?
Right. And I think, yeah, I know I agree with you, but I think this kind of comes to a really important point in where I believe we're headed as a scientific community, and that we're not working in silos anymore. Right. We're not working in our own private little siloed section of, yeast or bacteria or humans, right? It's really this team science approach where we're looking across organisms, we're looking across species, we're looking at across disciplines. And we have to move in that direction in order to better understand how these pieces fit together. And I think that's one of the pieces, one of the things that was really groundbreaking about this work was just the broad diversity of sequences we included. And so yes, we could have just included, human reference genome and all of the human sequencing that's available, But the approach that was taken for Evo 2 was really to understand how these pieces fit together. And I think that's also what makes it so revolutionary in our time.
Perfect. And maybe let's now speak a little bit more about your team's role in this multi-team effort, and it's specifically around this concept. I believe that you did not, on purpose, you did not put in certain genomes to be to this to the learning model,
Yeah.
right? I think there's specifically virus that infect humans. I believe was one of the things, right? Was that the only thing? And how did you? What was that conversation around the table? How does everyone come up with, okay, what we should do here from a ethical and a biosafety perspective?
Right. And so this was really fun to think about and it's fun in a couple ways. One, because this is sort of an emergent, well, no, biosafety has been along for a long time, but this is an emerging space, and how we think about this is in regards to like what we're doing with Evo. So actually there is a list of viruses that are on the biosafety watch list, right? And so we actually specifically excluded those sequences from the training of Evo. And then once Evo 2 was trained, we actually put those sequences in to see if it could recognize these pathogens, and it could not. So we were really excited that we had, done our due diligence in ensuring that these biosafety features were not included. We also, and then the other piece is, we've had a lot of ethical discussions on what does it mean to create new sequences? What does it mean to create new species? How does that fit into the overall um, environmental, what is the environmental impact of that? And so even with Eva 1, we had a piece on how we think about this generation of new sequences, synthetic sequences, and how it can change the biodiversity of our systems. And so that was, we spent a lot of time really trying to think about and pulling on experts to help us think about, first of all, in the safety piece, what are these specific pathogens that we want to be sure that we cannot generate, or we want to be sure that is not included in the training information for our model. So that was one piece. And then the second piece was the sort of the equity piece, and ensuring that, from the human genome sequence aspect, we weren't just developing a model that was going to benefit a particular population over another. So those were kind of the two thought pieces behind that. And so it was, it was a lot of teamwork, a lot of diversity in our teams, kind of pulling together and thinking about what this would mean. But we excluded, the pathogens was the biggest piece that we worked on excluding, right? um, and we just wanted to be sure that, because it is open source, right, the entire model is open source, the training data is open source, everything is open source. So we wanted to be sure that we did our best to ensure that it would be used responsibly, and we did our best to ensure that it would be that biosafety was a top concern.
I think everyone thanks you and your team for doing that, because I'm sure no one wants a super generative model that can create super viruses. But that's the part
Exactly.
I didn't fully understand that part, and maybe this part we you can tell me, oh, okay, you need to go back and kind of really look into why this is the case. What I didn't understand was, if you didn't teach, if this model is generative, meaning it can create kind of new genomes, why can't it create like a viral genome that infects humans if you didn't train it on that? Is it because there's some is it because the viral genome is different enough? I guess there's something different enough about it that, since it was not trained on that, this model hasn't learned that sort of nuance. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, you can think about it that way. Yes. So because it wasn't trained on that, right? It's not learning exactly the specific traits of those pathogens, or those those aspects of that section. So, specifically, there are specific traits about these pathogens that we just didn't want the model to learn. And so by excluding those, so remember, we're using all of these different species to train the model. And by excluding particular species or these specific pathogens, it's not learning that sequence. Now, could it by chance develop these? It probably could by chance, but we wanted to do our best to ensure it wasn't learning that to begin with.
That's completely fair. And maybe I'm going to do a little bit of a hard pivot here to something that I think that it's very near and dear, I'm sure, to your heart. It's been something that I've talked to a couple of guests about. Is around this idea of how do you the implementation of tools like AI in the healthcare setting, but making sure that there's equity within that sort of approach. So how do you, because that is one, I guess, I don't believe people talk about enough. Everyone thinks the hard part is developing the tools, which I don't disagree. That is a very, very challenging aspect. But it seems to me that adopting tools sometimes is actually even harder because an example I would give would be telemedicine. I mean, that's been around for I don't know how long, right? For at least a decade. And then it really wasn't implemented until COVID. It's like we were forced to implement it, hence we had to implement it. So how do you, maybe you can riff a little bit on that front about some of your work that you've been doing from an implementation perspective, because you've spoken quite a bit about it in a couple of pieces in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and you really are talking my language here, because one of the things that I like to talk about is sort of the AI life cycle, right? And so what is the AI life cycle? So a lot of times when we talk about AI, we're so focused on the actual model. Right. The model performance, the area under the curve, the accuracy of the model. And to me, that is just one piece in the AI life cycle. So what does the AI life cycle include, right? Well, it starts with the type of data you use to train the model, right? How diverse is that data? What's the origination of that data? In a lot of our work, we're using data from electronic health records from a healthcare system. But it's important to think, and I tell my students this, well, who has access to that healthcare system? And more importantly, who doesn't? Because that's going to define who your model is going to work on and who it might not work on. More importantly, when you think about who's coming to the healthcare system, when do you go to the hospital? You go to the hospital when you're sick, when you're really sick. And the sicker you are, the more data we have on you. So the model is really good at understanding and predicting these very sick patients. But when you have somebody who is maybe not as sick, they might avoid the hospital. So we don't have a lot of information on those people. The second piece in the AI life cycle is really the constraints we have for using data, right? Certainly in healthcare, we have regulations and policies for how we can and cannot use data. So this also predicts how we can, the data we can use to train a model. So let me give you an example. If I'm using data from Stanford Healthcare System, and I want to look at Alaska Natives and, diabetic outcomes in Alaska Natives, that population in my healthcare setting is going to be very small. And so I might have to combine those patients with another group of people just because of my HIPAA regulations. And so that's going to really determine how I develop my model. Right. And so then when we move, like, so on my AI life cycle, we have the data, but the next piece is like, what types of models are you developing? And why are you choosing one model over another? Right. And so in our AI world, right, you can use, I mean, we have so many different tools, a random forest, a logistic regression, a large language model now, right? And so why you choose one model over another is really important when we start thinking about those biases and implementation. Right. And then once you take all of that and put it into your model evaluation, but then that final piece, which is what you were getting at, is really model deployment. And how do we deploy a model into the healthcare setting, and how do we think about those biases, right? Because when we're creating these data and we're generating these data, it becomes very different from the data we see in the healthcare setting. And so we have to think about, clinician biases, healthcare system biases, and that is a huge life cycle that we need to think about, with a lot of focus just on one of those areas, which is like model evaluation.
Absolutely. I think it's really. I like this holistic approach that you and your team have been taken to seeing. I like the term like AI lifecycle actually makes a lot of sense in the healthcare setting, and specifically, I know there's going to be pushback in terms. Some people are going to push back in terms of like in the healthcare setting from a deployment perspective. What do you mean by bias? Maybe you can give example of where maybe bias could manifests itself or how it manifests itself in the kind of deployment. And any example would be great.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And so let me let me give you an example. I'm like thinking of an example right now. So when we deploy a model in healthcare, there's several different ways it can be deployed. So if we think about a prediction algorithm, so let's say I'm providing a risk score for a patient, and I'll give you like just a hypothetical example. Let's say I'm developing a risk score for a patient who's starting chemotherapy for cancer treatment. And I want to predict how well they're going to respond to a particular chemotherapy. And so what I might develop might be a XGB boost model that's going to provide me a risk score on the scale of 0 to 1, and I might define a threshold for when that patient might be considered high risk. So let's say arbitrarily, I might define a threshold. So if a patient has a score over 0.75, I might say they're at high risk for an adverse event with that chemotherapy. But how I provide that to the healthcare system, right? Do I just say, give them a flag, red, green, yellow, high risk, low risk, or intermediate risk? Do I say this patient is high risk because their white blood cell count is extremely low? Uh, do I, provide them with actual numbers and confidence intervals and uncertainty estimations around that risk score? So these are all decisions we make in the deployment space, and how that information is interpreted can introduce bias into the healthcare system, right? So for example, if I'm providing a red, green, yellow flag to a very experienced oncologist, they might say, you know what, I know I've been doing this for 25 years, I know more. They haven't provided me enough information about how they came up with this number. I'm going to ignore it. Or the opposite, this is AI. I believe it. Even though I might not think this is the right thing, I've got to trust it. So it can go in all of these different directions. And so that's why when we think about model deployment, like the explainability and the transparency is so key to ensuring that we take these biases into account. So for example, if I give this risk score to an oncologist and I say, you know what, I'm, 75% certain that this patient will have an event, or, you know what, I'm 50% certain that this patient will have one of these events. That might be interpreted differently by different people, but it might provide enough information to know whether they can trust that risk score or not. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm trying to provide you with some information on the
Yes.
complexity of deployment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very. Sorry, I gave you a question that was maybe too open ended in terms of in terms of that. So apologies for that. But yeah, I think the audience probably gets your the point is that it's very, very complicated, and a lot of what your team is suggesting is you must take that into account for anything to be successfully deployed right
Right.
into the healthcare care setting, which actually absolutely makes a lot of sense that we need
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah.
Now, how did because you've done a lot of work in both the AI space and the bioethics space. How did you go down this track? Like, what motivated you down this avenue? Because
Yeah.
it is a little bit, I have to say, admit, it's a little bit esoteric. It's a very different way of looking at like the technologies in general.
Right, right, right. And so, I guess my background has really driven me to care about how we think about diverse populations and equity in healthcare. And so I've always had this focus on, health equity and health disparities. And so once I started really, and data has always been sort of a driving force behind my career, and understanding how data can be so helpful to understand a lot of these problems and issues and questions we have about healthcare is so enlightening, but also understanding its limitations and where it can provide cause harm to different populations. And so because of my background, where I've grown up in a very rural setting where we did not have healthcare. We were not somebody who was represented in the data that's being used today to develop these models. I'm very sensitive for how these algorithms can potentially widen that disparities gap. And this kind of takes us back to that conversation with Evo too, is that I was really adamant, and the team was really adamant, that we didn't want to just develop another tool that is going to only benefit a population that already has much of the benefits, right? We wanted to ensure that it worked across all populations equally. And how do we do that? Well, we did that by ensuring that it wasn't just trained on the human reference genome, where we know it's missing a lot of diversity. And so I think that, you know ensuring that these tools we develop really benefit all populations, and wearing my hat, benefit like populations that I came from, is really important.
That's amazing. Of course, from an occupation perspective, there's many occupations that could have actually, you could have gone down. Obviously, incredibly intelligent. Of course, I'm
Of
not. I'm
course.
not. I know you have. So you could have probably done anything. So you could have been probably a lawyer that tackled this issue, or a doctor that tackles this issue from sorry, by doctor I mean someone who, like practicing medical medicine in,
Mhm.
say, rural, like say rural America. You could have done it that way, but you took like the science route, and a very, like, about ethics, but melding that with technology route. Like, what why down that route? Like, what was it about your childhood, or how you growing up, that
So I will say that so I grew up in a very small town, a very rural town, where we there were no at the time there were no colleges. There were, it was very small, but one thing that I liked was data and technology. So and it was one thing that I really could understand and grasp. And so when I went to my parents and said, hey, I want to go to college, they were like, well, why? Why why would you do that when there's so much to do here at home, etc. And so when I first went to school, I was like, well, because I grew up in a rural area where we had a lot of farm animals, etc. I'm like, well, I'm going to become a veterinarian, because that way I could bring it back home. And they were like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. But so of course, once you take the girl from the rural environment and put her in a big city, and just that whole world explodes of opportunities. I went down several different paths. And so I was really considering medical school, but to be honest, for me it was a balance, right? I really wanted a balance between sort of that population effect versus that individual care. And so I went down the route. I first went to graduate school for public health and chronic disease epidemiology. How do we think about cancer? How do we think about diabetes? How do we think about the data needed to understand the epidemiology and the development of these diseases? And then from there, it just kind of went down that path. but I always thought there was opportunity to think about how data in particular could really help us think about a lot of these disparities, differences, inequities in our world.
God, excellent. Appreciate that very much. Everyone seems like a lot of people I talk to, they want to be a vet. It seems like very, very common theme amongst everyone. I think I would have loved doing that too. I have a dog, and
Yeah.
she recently had to go to the vet, which is, I mean, that was just such a scary thing for me. Never having
Right.
a yes dog before, and the vets are amazing. They just make you feel so like they're special people. I have to say.
Yes, right, exactly, exactly. So I think it was, for me, it was my passion was really data and thinking about, how we can use data to address these problems. And I think I was fortunate that, when I started really, diving into my academic career, I had the opportunity to study electronic health records. I had the opportunity to work with like statisticians and data scientists and really learn and understand how we could pull those together. So I think it's really about knowing your passion, staying focused in that passion, and using the tools and resources you have to move that forward.
Absolutely amazing. And you spoke about the idea of, I think around, I think I've seen you write about this a couple of times about the idea of trust and a lot of that around transparency to that leads down to trust.
Yes.
I'm wondering, given the current landscape, which I think, right now it's, 2025, right? March 13th today. I think there's a lot of maybe less trust in science in
Yeah.
I don't want to say that too harshly, but there's a lot of mistrust in the world today,
There
right?
is.
Ho-
Yeah.
so maybe, like, how do you think about, especially AI, something that a lot of people feel is incredibly scary because it's like, oh, AI is going to take my job type of that's how people think about it right now. Some people at least. So how do you make sure that people trust it? Because it is, I agree, incredibly powerful tool. I think, especially in the healthcare setting, it seems like it's like the perfect tool for the
Right.
healthcare setting in some ways.
Yeah. So I think, trust is the fundamental piece of what we're doing. And if you don't build trust with your stakeholders, you can never be successful with AI. So what does that mean, right? I mean that when we build trust, right, we have to, I mean, let's just break this down because I think it's so important. And when we think about AI, right now we have a lot of AI algorithms that don't work for certain populations, right? Because they've been built with biased data, non-representative data. We've seen this over and over in the news and in the media about AI algorithms for hiring purposes, for salaries, and just how they go wrong. But so because those AI algorithms have shown to be biased or not worked well, they've caused harm in certain populations, right? And so when they cause harm, people don't trust them anymore. People don't want to use them. But more importantly, people don't want to contribute to them. They don't want to share their data, share their experience, share their insights. And so by having those algorithms not working and causing harm, we have this lack of sharing of data, sharing of engagement. And because we lack this data sharing and engagement, well, obviously the algorithms don't work for that population. So it's like a catch 22 where we've got to do a better job in building trust between patients and healthcare providers so that we can demonstrate that what AI can benefit everyone if we have the trust and the data and the knowledge and really understanding the societal impacts of the questions we're asking with these tools, the data we're using to develop them. So I think the trust piece is really fundamental to ensuring that what we develop responsibly and equitably. And so that's something we do a lot of work in.
Do you believe that, to develop that trust, it seems like a lot of it that at least what I'm hearing is that it's around being thoughtful, at least that it not that you get everything right because that's that's like an impossible task, right? But just
Yeah.
being incredibly thoughtful about it, and people can see that there is that the intent is supposed to help people, and your intent is not necessarily malicious or anything like putting down anyone, but it's to help individuals, and being thoughtful about that is something that you believe will help with the um, developing trust.
Yes, absolutely. And so and what does that mean? So we talk a lot of in the AI space about having, partnerships and engaging diverse stakeholders. But while we talk about it a lot, I still think it is a big gap in what we've been developing and deploying in the space. And so I think that, even though we do all have the best, I hope that we all are trying to better everyone's health and well-being with these tools. I think it's important that we're transparent about how, again, how the data that was used to train these models, the questions we're asking, the community partnerships that we build. Because if I'm transparent in a lot of this information, I think we can better understand where a particular algorithm can or cannot be applied. Right. And so let me give you an example. So, Stanford data, for example, can be biased. It is a very special, not special, but it's a very, the population at Stanford healthcare is very different from the general population in the US or in Canada or in other countries. Right. But what does that mean? Does that mean I can't use my data? No, not at all. We use our data all the time, but we're very transparent about how these models were developed, what types of data were included in their development, what populations are represented and what populations aren't represented. And by being transparent about that information, I think we really can foster trust and accountability between, developers, researchers, and the communities they serve. And so I would hope that this type of transparency would extend to, also how we think about education and training for, our, not only our data scientists, but also our healthcare providers, our patients, our communities, so that they, when they hear that, AI tool is being used to, synthesize your information or to write this email, they understand, what are the pros and cons of that technology.
Great, and yeah, I guess that's the I guess that's one of the challenging parts is how, because there's so much information, and doctors, actually not just doctors, but everyone, there's so much inundation of just information, data. How do you help someone, I guess, understand it? I guess, is it enough just to be transparent and say, hey, here's all the data. You don't actually like it's out there. I'm not hiding anything. Is that sufficient, or you did say mention an education part, a
Yes.
component to that as well, right? I guess
Yes.
that is the key. You have to somehow disseminate and then educate as well.
It is because we talk about education is key to this, and we talk about, like engaging communities and patients, but we have to be able to speak the same language. And when I say speak the same language, we have to be able to convey what we're developing or the tool that we're presenting. We have to present it in a way that is understandable across populations, right? And so, for example, for AI systems that involve complex sets and like complex technologies, we have to be able to translate that into a non-technical, dialogue, so that people can understand and be engaged. And that's hard, right? Because these are very complex systems we're talking about. So education, it goes on both sides, right? We need to educate our patients and communities to understand these tools, but we also need to educate our developers and our data scientists to have these conversations, right? And to how do we translate what we're doing into a dialogue that can really help with transparency and foster trust. So it's education yeah, across the cycle, right?
And that's great because that's why probably the evil team brought you on and others on that had much more holistic approach because of
Right.
this. They understood, maybe they understood what they didn't understand, so they wanted to bring in others who can help out. So I think
Right.
that speaks a
And
lot to
I yeah, absolutely. And I cannot speak highly enough of Brian, he and his team, and because they were so thoughtful in that, right? I think they could have done Evo 2 without any mention of biosafety or equity, and it would have been still an amazing paper, but they didn't, right? They really wanted to be thoughtful about the transparency of how they developed the algorithm, which is why it was open source, but also about how we thought about really making this safe and making it something that was equitable across populations. So, I mean, kudos to Brian for really being so thoughtful in that piece, and we were just excited to be involved in this work because it was so amazing, and they're a great team.
great, absolutely great. I guess one thing about the transparent, just going back to transparency piece, I guess my question there is why would would it be enough just to put whatever was developed that has that's AI powered just do clinical trials? Is that sufficient, or do these tools need an almost like an additional layer of what scrutinization? I don't know how best to put that part.
And it's always a balance between innovation and regulation, right? And this is a very hard conversation, and you will get very diverse opinions on that. And so if you lean too far to either side, you lose that balance. So it is a balance between allowing innovation and allowing technology development, but also putting on guardrails to ensure it's safe and equitable. And so that balance is, it's really difficult. And let me just a little bit more on that. I mean, we talk about making sure that we develop fair AI systems and fair algorithms, but there's no consensus on what fair means, right? So how can we say that our algorithm is fair? I mean, fair according to whose definition, right? Because my definition might be different than your definition. And so I think that's a big challenge right now is there's no standard definition or metrics for what is fair or what is ethical. And it again, it's a balance, and our definitions differ across teams, across sections, across everything. So that's a big challenge.
And it all comes back to just more groups need to come together and work together, right? To try to
Absolutely.
just explain. Yes, absolutely. I think that's amazing. I don't want to take up too much of your time because I know you're really, very busy and we're already up against the kind of the hour that we had slotted. Maybe last question is just I'm sure there's tons of things that you're working on in next year or so, but what stands out for you? And I don't want you to. This might be a tricky one because it's almost like
Yeah.
picking a child and like which one's like better looking, right? So
Yeah.
so take that the way that you want to take it. But what kind of excites you? Maybe not about your specific research, but research in general in the coming
Yeah.
year or years.
Yeah, so one of the things I think that is sort of exciting and where I see us moving into is, we talked a lot about data during our hour together, and we talked about data diversity and the complexity of data. And I think that over the next, several years, we are going to better capture diverse data. I think, in healthcare, we use electronic healthcare records a lot for prediction models. I think that is just one piece of the evidence we need to develop these models. So, where I think we're going is we're developing more and more technologies that are going to better capture diverse types of information. So, we're looking at ambient AI and how we can capture those things, including environmental factors, factors related to social determinants of health. and really the systematic capture and integration of those into our AI models, I think is going to improve them for everyone, not just for certain populations, but for everyone, because we can better understand individual needs and individual complexities so that when we make predictions, they're based on the individual in front of us, not a group of individuals that we studied retrospectively.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I wear this. I don't know you. This is a Garmin. I wear you all the time when I'm sleeping, so it has tons of data. That would be amazing if it could actually integrate into my own personal generative model. That would be actually absolutely fascinating.
Exactly, exactly. So I think that's my hope for where we're going. We'll see, right?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Tina, for joining us today on What's with RWE. What's the best way of finding you and your work if someone wants to communicate with you? Is it just via email to your Stanford website
Via
or
exactly,
go
via
ahead?
email at Stanford. We also have a website at Stanford. It's the Boussard Lab at Stanford. And so that has a lot of information on our research, on our funded grants, and a lot of like our news articles and what we're talking about. So those are two ways to reach me.
Yes, I'll put that in the show notes. Do you use X or Twitter? Because I do see that you have a. Is that? I think that's your account, right?
I
It's
use
Tina
LinkedIn more. I do
LinkedIn more. Okay.
I used to use X, but my account was hacked and I was never able to recover it, which mean I had to start all over last year and I was just, oof, it was a lot of work. So I
Got
use
it. Okay.
LinkedIn. Mhm.
Okay, perfect. So we'll put that in the show notes below as well. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today and having this conversation, fascinating conversation about AI, implementing AI, and of course making sure that it is fair and of course there's equity in terms of the outcomes that come out from this implementation of AI in healthcare. So appreciate that very much. Please like, subscribe. If you have any comments, feel free to comment below. And everyone have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Tina.
Thanks so much for having me.